Hey viewers, Fallout New Vegas is not a particularly good-looking game. It looks terrible when judged by the standards of 2010, let alone by today's standards. Comparing New Vegas to contemporaneous games like Just Cause 2 or Grand Theft Auto 4 paints an extremely unflattering picture. But why is this game so ugly? Is it the urine yellow filter smeared over everything? Removing that with a weather mod helps, but the game still looks bad. Is it the basic modeling and low-resolution texture work? No, because other games from around the same time have similarly poor asset quality. Such are the limitations imposed by 6th-generation console hardware. Nevertheless, most other games manage to look a lot better. The real reason Fallout New Vegas looks so bad, at least the biggest reason, is a total lack of indirect lighting. Nothing casts a shadow in New Vegas except for NPCs. While the lack of shadows can look okay at night or on overcast days, it looks horribly wrong most of the time. Often it looks like objects are floating above the terrain because there's nothing grounding them into the world. And this is why other games from the same time period look better than Fallout 3 and New Vegas. Most of them have real-time shadow maps, or at least baked-in lighting. And some of them had more advanced effects like ambient occlusion, God rays, cube map reflections, and volumetric fog. Over the years, 3 major add-ons have released that add these effects to Fallout New Vegas: ENB, Reshade, and New Vegas Reloaded. I call these the unholy trinity of crashes, visual glitches, and lag. But we have to use at least one of them to get the effects we want, and in 2023 and beyond, it's very obvious that ENB is on its way out, and New Vegas Reloaded has become the dominant graphics injector. Why is ENB so bad? Where do I start? First off, I will say that one thing ENB has in its favor is performance. Running an entire ENB preset with every effect enabled will probably cost you the same number of frames as simply turning on shadows in New Vegas Reloaded. But then come the problems. ENB isn't compatible with DXVK, or at least I haven't ever gotten them both to work together properly, even when using ENB's proxy library function. The game opens, but performance is completely terrible, negating any benefit DXVK would normally bring. Worse still, ENB is not compatible with MSAA. MSAA is pretty much the gold standard for anti-aliasing. It's an expensive form of anti-aliasing, but it's worth it to get a smooth, clean picture. Without access to MSAA, you'll have to settle for inferior shader-based anti-aliasing methods like FXAA or SMAA. Both of these methods can be added with Reshade, or you can find them packaged with certain ENB presets. It's also still possible to use super sampling to render the game at a higher resolution and downscale it to fit your monitor, but that will harm your performance even more. As if ruining your anti-aliasing wasn't bad enough, most ENB presets are also incompatible with the vanilla game's image space effects, so instead of fading to black when getting healed by a doctor, nothing will happen. If you want to use a night vision mod, or even the vanilla game's cat eye, you'll be shit out of luck. Additionally, ENB's shadow maps are problematic because they have the same problem a lot of old games have. The only shadow casting light source is the sun. So all the fabulous lights of New Vegas, all the outdoor campfires, all those dingy lights in interiors, none of them cast shadows with ENB. Shadows also tend to disappear when the object casting them moves off screen, which makes the edges of the screen look like an absolute mess. There's some other problems like ENB not working with the improved lighting shaders mod, so exterior cells are limited to 4 lights each. But by now I think I've said enough to turn you off of ENBs forever. The fact is, New Vegas Reloaded does everything ENBs can do, and then some. As for Reshade, in many ways it's more annoying than ENB. Its depth buffer detection also isn't compatible with MSAA, which means all but the most basic effects will break unless you restrict yourself to alternative anti-aliasing methods, which are either inferior or extremely expensive. And even when you do everything right, the depth buffer can stop working for no reason whenever the hell it wants, which is infuriating. When the depth buffer does work, reshade effects bleed on top of the first-person view model, which looks horrible. Thankfully, New Vegas Reloaded fixes this issue by replacing the depth buffer, but that doesn't help with the unreliable detection issue. And Reshade has no idea where the HUD is, so its effects will influence the game's interface, which can often make it more difficult to read. ENB and New Vegas Reloaded don't have this problem. For these reasons, I wouldn't recommend using Reshade for anything besides basic color correction and shader anti-aliasing. New Vegas Reloaded is what you'll need to rely on to improve this game's graphics for the most part, but just a few months ago, another very interesting mod called Real-Time Reflections released that adds cube map reflections. These cube map reflections look incredible on windows or scope reticles. Unfortunately, vanilla models aren't set up to use reflections, and forcing reflections on every shiny surface through the INI can look bad in as many situations as it looks good. It might be advisable to wait a little while before using this mod until the New Vegas Mesh Improvement mod adds correct shader flags to appropriate objects. Then these cube map reflections will look a lot better. Anyways, this video is going nowhere fast. I think it's time I actually gave you some advice on how to configure New Vegas Reloaded to achieve a decent level of graphical quality without breaking the bank, so to speak, on our rendering budget. Everyone's hardware is different, and so are everyone's goals. Some people want the best graphics possible and don't mind having to play at 30 FPS to achieve that. Others would prefer a high refresh rate experience to make use of their fancy VRR monitors. I definitely belong to the latter camp. I don't want to play a 13-year-old game at the same frame rate I played it at when it came out. Before you try to install New Vegas Reloaded, make sure you have a graphics card that's up to snuff. If you have a GTX 1050 Ti or something like that, don't even bother. You won't be able to get a good experience, even at 1080p. New Vegas Reloaded is extremely performance intensive, even if you disable a lot of its effects. You're also going to want the mod NVR and ENB Hair AO Transparency Fix. Without this mod, hair and beards will have a weird outline surrounding them when you use NVR, but the mod changes the meshes of all the vanilla hairstyles to fix the problem. To install New Vegas Reloaded, you have to go to their Discord server and download the latest nightly build. Then you can add it to Vortex or Mod Organizer 2 like any other mod. You'll know it worked because a watermark will appear at the bottom of your screen when launching Fallout New Vegas. To configure NVR in-game, you press the O key and use the arrow keys to navigate settings. If your screen isn't large enough, you'll need to use page up and page down to access some of the options. The numpad plus and minus keys are used to make changes. If you're using a keyboard that lacks some of these keys, you'll have to do some rebinding in the configuration file. I linked a picture in the description that will help you with that. Alright, on to the settings. Ambient occlusion has a huge impact on both frame rate and image quality. This is probably the most important graphical effect New Vegas Reloaded adds. It should always be left on unless you absolutely need the extra frames. Blood does nothing, blood lens seems to do nothing either, leave them both off. Bloom can make bright colors pop more, but it has a small performance impact, so I don't think it's worth enabling unless you have some overhead. Cinema and coloring have little to no performance impact, so adjust them however you like, or leave them off, it doesn't matter. Debug is not useful to the average user, so leave it off. Depth of field has a surprisingly massive effect on performance. It's a nice looking effect, and it can go a long way to hide the hideous LOD models and Z-fighting at a distance FNV is plagued with, but the cost simply isn't worth the benefit for me. Depth of field is the first thing I turn off. Exposure brightens or darkens the entire screen when it feels like it's necessary at a small performance cost. I would leave this off and adjust the brightness in the display settings menu or through your monitor instead. Extra effects and extra shaders should be left on so you can use the real-time reflections mod. God rays have a mid-size effect on performance, but they enhance sunrise and sunset scenes a great deal. Definitely keep God rays on unless you absolutely have no choice but to disable them. Grass and HDR do nothing right now. Image Adjust is useful for playing around with colors and has almost no performance impact. Personally, I leave it off and let my weather mod handle the colors, but you can play with this to your liking. Lens and low health are useless and make it harder to play the game. Leave them off. Motion blur has very little impact on performance and helps smooth out camera movement, especially at low frame rates. Enabling or disabling it is more of a personal taste thing. I like to leave it on, but you can do whatever you want. POM does nothing. Precipitations has a significant performance cost during rainy weathers, but I think it's worth it to have rain that doesn't fall straight through roofs. And now we move on to shadows, which are the biggest frame rate destroying feature in New Vegas Reloaded. While they look a hell of a lot better than ENB shadows, they can still look blotchy and incorrect at a distance, and the shadow cascade changes are easily visible unless you double the shadow map resolution to 2048, which will harm your performance even more. Luckily, shadows have been separated into exterior and interior options, and since I have a much higher frame rate in interiors, I like to turn off exterior shadows and save them for interior environments. To compensate for the lack of shadows in exteriors, I increase the strength of the ambient occlusion. The least expensive part of shadow rendering is screen space shadows, so you could exclusively enable those if you want to see some vague, shadowy blobs while keeping most of your performance. But I prefer to turn off exterior shadows completely. Keep in mind, if you have a more powerful graphics card than me, or you play at 1080p, or you're okay with a 60 FPS presentation, you can keep exterior shadows on, but I want to get over 80 FPS at all times, so this is the trade-off I have to make. Sharpening has almost no effect on performance, so adjust it to your personal preference or leave it off. Skin does nothing. Sky doesn't seem to do anything for me either. Maybe it only works if you install someone else's preset. I've also read that it's incompatible with real-time reflections, so I leave it off. Snow is just like precipitation, but it adds snow particles instead of rain. This one is less important because only the area around Jacobstown has any snow. Of course, there's always modded areas, or the Anchorage simulation if you're using Tale of Two Wastelands, but 99% of the time you won't be seeing snow, so it might be a good idea to leave this option off to save performance. The same goes for snow accumulation. Snow accumulation is a cool idea, but distant areas look terrible with it enabled. It also looks weird to see shader snow layered on top of texture snow. I'd advise leaving this option off unless you want to do a full winter playthrough, but for that you could use a snowy texture pack and save yourself 20 FPS. Specular doesn't do very much except accentuate the specular highlights the game already has, but holy shit does it have an outsized impact on performance. I can gain 15% more frames just from turning the setting off. Disabling it is an absolute no-brainer. Terrain does nothing. Underwater adds some nice caustic effects, so keep it on. Volumetric fog doesn't affect performance much, but the effect can cause bright outlines to appear on thin objects, so I think it's best to tone it down a little. Or you can turn it off to gain a few frames if you're desperate. Water replaces the game's regular water shaders with greatly superior ones, at not too much of a performance cost, so leave it on. Water lens adds a splash effect to the camera when you exit water. You might as well leave it on. Wet World adds puddles and raindrop effects whenever it rains. There's a pretty large performance impact to this, but it looks so good there's no way I could ever turn it off. And that's all the settings New Vegas Reloaded has. With my optimized settings, I get over twice the frames per second I'd get from blindly enabling everything, and it looks better to boot. I've never seen Fallout New Vegas looking better than this. Now all I need is some retexture mods, and I need to replace the disgusting LOD models, and then I'll be set. Fallout New Vegas is running really well for me. It's super stable right now. So until next time, folks, toodles!